After living in China for 20 years, I've heard the same question a million times. Do you have a Chinese wife? And my answer is usually very simple. No, I have a wife from my hometown. What's interesting is that very often when I say this, Chinese people give me a thumbs up. There's an immediate understanding there, almost as if they don't need a long explanation. They just get it. So in this video, I want to talk about that choice. Not to defend it and not to compare anything, but to explain how I see it now. When did I actually make this decision? Why did it become important to me? And what are the different angles that underpin this choice of finding a lifelong partner from my own culture? When I think about why I married a woman from my home country after living in China for so long, the first thing that comes to mind is something I call cultural default settings. My wife and I share very similar childhood references, similar conflict styles, and a similar general mindset. Over time, I realized that this matters much more than I used to think. I didn't just want a partner in life, I wanted someone whose default way of seeing the world felt familiar to me. I'm from Russia, and gradually I understood that I naturally gravitate toward a partner from a similar cultural space. Not because one culture is better or worse than another, but because it aligns more closely with how my mind works. Cultural default settings matter far more than people usually realize. When I was younger, I had a Chinese girlfriend. I was very young, very emotional, very hot-blooded. At that time, I was even seriously thinking about marriage, but the longer we stayed together, the more I began to notice something subtle but important. It wasn't that we didn't care about each other. It wasn't that we didn't try. It was that emotionally, mentally, and culturally, it was very difficult for us to fully align. It felt like a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces are almost right, very close, but not exactly. And that almost becomes very important when you start thinking about a lifelong relationship. I want to be very clear here. I don't blame her, not at all, and I don't blame myself either. That wasn't anyone's fault. It was simply the reality of two people shaped by different cultural default settings, trying to build something very deep together. Sometimes effort and good intentions are not enough to close that final gap. That experience taught me something I still think about today. For a lifelong partner, for a lifelong companion, similarity in mindset matters enormously. In my case, that similarity is Western, and even more importantly, it comes from sharing a common cultural background. One reason for this is something people often underestimate: humor. Humor is incredibly important in a relationship. It helps smooth the rough edges of daily life. It helps release tension. It allows small conflicts to dissolve instead of turning into something heavier. And humor is deeply cultural. When two people share the same cultural background, a single phrase, a quote from a movie, a book, or a song can immediately put both people on the same page. What could have become an argument suddenly turns into a joke. What could have stayed as frustration becomes a funny memory you laugh about later. That kind of emotional shorthand is not a small thing. It's a part of what keeps a long-term relationship stable, meaningful, and alive. It creates a sense of ease in difficult moments when words alone are not enough. And that's why for me, cultural default settings ended up being one of the most important factors in choosing a life partner. The second angle is something I learned the hard way. Language is not the same as emotional fluency. I can speak Chinese, I use it in daily life, at work, and in many practical situations, but emotional nuance is different. When I say something in Chinese, I understand the meaning, but I don't always feel it deeply. When I say the same thing in English, I feel it more, and when I say it in Russian, it goes even deeper. This doesn't mean one language is better than another. It simply means that emotions live at different depth, depending on the language you grew up with. Arguing, explaining feelings, or resolving conflicts in a second language costs much more energy. You're not only thinking about what you want to say, but also how to say it correctly. And while you're doing that, part of the emotion gets lost. Sometimes the vocabulary itself becomes a limitation. Take a simple word like happy. It's useful, but it's also very general. Sometimes you don't mean just happy. Sometimes you mean exhilarated, ecstatic, deeply grateful, or even blessed. Those differences matter, especially in close relationships. I've noticed this with many of my foreign friends who are married to Chinese women. Very often they communicate in English. Sometimes they switch to Chinese, which I think is great and actually brings them closer to the culture, but in many emotional moments they fall back on English, and English becomes a kind of simplified bridge language. The problem is that simplified language can also simplify emotions. You end up using a smaller emotional toolbox, not because you don't feel deeply, but because you don't have the words that feel natural enough to carry that depth. And for me, that's important. In a long-term relationship, being able to express frustration, warmth, irony, tenderness, or humor with precision matters. If I constantly feel that I'm translating myself, not just words but emotions, that becomes tiring over time. I want to be very clear. This is not a criticism of people who fully integrate, marry locally, and live their lives in another language. In many ways, that actually brings them closer to the culture, and I respect that deeply. But for me personally, emotional fluency, being able to say exactly what I feel with the right weight and nuance, matters a lot. And that fluency is strongest in my native language and in a shared cultural context. That's why for me, language became more than a communication tool. It became a deciding factor in how deeply and honestly I could connect in a lifelong relationship. The third angle is something that took me a long time to fully understand. When you get married, you don't just marry a person, you marry a system. Marriage doesn't exist in isolation. It includes family expectations, traditions, and ideas about how life should be organized. And those expectations can be very different depending on the culture you come from. For example, in China, it's often expected that during major holidays you spend time in your wife's hometown with her parents. Family gatherings, obligations, and presents are very important. In Russia, this works quite differently. Of course, families matter there too, but the structure and expectations are not the same. Another thing I noticed is that in China, both women and men are often under strong parental influence when it comes to life decisions. Parents can play a very active role, sometimes in housing, career choices, marriage timing, and even daily life. From what I've seen, the influence can be quite significant. Now, I want to be very careful here. Every family is different. Not all Chinese parents are the same. And in Russia, parents can also be very involved. So this is not a black and white comparison, but overall, the systems are different. For me personally, it feels natural to think that once you build your own family, that family becomes the main unit. Decisions come primarily from the partnership between two people. Parents can give advice, and that advice is often welcome, but advice is different from expectation or obligation. When advice turns into "this is how you should live" or "this is what you must do," that crosses a line for me. Not because I don't respect parents, but because my understanding of family is built around independence and responsibility. I want to make my own decisions with my partner, and even if those decisions turn out to be mistakes, I want them to be our mistakes. Mistakes you learn from, mistakes that help you grow. I don't feel comfortable being spoon-fed through life or living according to someone else's instructions, even if they come from a place of care. Again, this isn't about good or bad. It's not a criticism of any culture. It's simply about different systems and different expectations. And over time, I realized that the system I feel most comfortable in is one where the couple stands at the center, with parents close by but not directing the path. That realization became another important piece in how I understood my own choices about marriage. And here goes an important question. Would my life in China be easier if I married a Chinese woman? And why does that question make me uncomfortable to even ask?